This morning, my question, will Ray Rice play in the NFL again? Plus, the new film, She's Beautiful When She's Angry, and why FDR moved Thanksgiving. But first, why we can't feel black men's pain. Good morning, I'm Melissa Harris Perry. Pain, agony, suffering, hurt. Our nation is full of pain, pain that has been given voice most recently in Ferguson, Missouri. The specific pain of parents who have lost a child and now know that the police officer who killed him will not face criminal charges. The pain of communities who feel helpless in the face of a system that brings so little justice, a system that seems to supply fresh trauma weekly, adding names to the list of unarmed men and boys whose death is justified by those who claim to have been afraid of them. Oscar, Trayvon, John, Michael, Tamir. The pain of black men themselves. And this is where I want to pause for a moment, this issue of black men's pain, because Americans long have had difficulty in understanding, acknowledging, and having empathy for the pain of black men. For much of our history, black men have been represented as merciless brutes, unpredictable super predators who can strike without warning at any moment. At the turn of the 20th century, George T. Winston, the president of North Carolina College of Agricultural and Mechanic Arts, what is now NC State University, wrote for the leading academic journal, Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, where he waxed nostalgic for the simpler times of slavery and explained that since emancipation, quote, when a knock is heard at the door, a white woman shudders with nameless horror. The black brute is lurking in the dark, a monstrous beast, crazed with lust. His ferocity is almost demonical. A mad bull or a tiger could scarcely be more brutal. Since the abolition of slavery and the growing up of a new generation of Negroes, crimes that are too hideous to describe have been committed every month, every week, frequently every day against the helpless women and children of the white race, crimes that were unknown in slavery. This myth of the black brute, incapable of pain himself, bent on inflicting pain on others, has been a recurring theme in much of American popular culture and politics, from D.W. Griffith's 1915 Birth of a Nation, which was screened by President Woodrow Wilson in the White House, to the unstoppably violent Clubber Lang, whose defeat by the everyman Rocky Balboa in Rocky III is read by some film critics as a less than subtle Reagan-era fantasy about defeating threatening black men. In this nation, when we look at black men and boys, our vision is structured by these powerful, oft-reproduced myths about black men that are deeply embedded in our collective history and psyche. Our history is relevant to our lives and our politics in this moment. We were reminded of this truth as recently as 6 years ago by none other than our current president, when he spoke out in Philadelphia about the issue of race in America.
Understanding this reality requires a reminder of how we arrived at this point. As William Faulkner once wrote, the past isn't dead and buried. In fact, it isn't even past. We do not need to recite here the history of racial injustice in this country. But we do need to remind ourselves that so many of the disparities that exist between the African American community and the larger American community today can be traced directly to inequalities passed on from an earlier generation that suffered under the brutal legacy of slavery and Jim Crow.
The past is not even past. Take the recent study in the British Journal of Developmental Psychology showing that starting at around 7 years of age, American children believe that black kids feel less pain than their white counterparts. In the past decade, multiple studies have convincingly shown that doctors offer black patients less pain management care because they believe the pain of black patients is simply less intense, less excruciating than the pain of white patients. During the trial of George Zimmerman for the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, Jason Silverstein of Slate.com cited some of this research when he argued the racial empathy gap helps explain disparities in everything from pain management to the criminal justice system. And the problem isn't just that people disregard the pain of black people. It's somehow even worse. The problem is that the pain isn't even felt. The pain isn't even felt, which brings us back to this week in Ferguson, Missouri, and the question of black men, their bodies, and their pain. Because this week, we learned that when he testified before the grand jury, Officer Darren Wilson said this about 18-year-old Michael Brown. And then, after he did that, Michael Brown, looked up at me and had the most intense, aggressive face. The only way I can describe it, it looks like a demon. That's how angry he looked. And we learned that when he described shooting the unarmed teenager, now former Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson, he resigned on Saturday, told the grand jury this. At this point, it looked like he was almost bulking up to run through the shots, like it was making him mad that I'm shooting him. And perhaps, because in his mind he was looking at an angry demon who could run through bullets, perhaps that is why Wilson said this in an interview to ABC News.
It sounds like you don't think you were responsible. I did my job that day.
And the St. Louis grand jury agreed. By returning no indictment, they asserted that no crime happened the day Officer Wilson took Michael Brown's life. It's a decision that unleashed more pain, more hurt, that is characterized as violent, destructive, and requiring policing. Because as Khalil Muhammad wrote for The Nation this week, even with such evidence in hand that black men are 21 times as likely to be killed by law enforcement than white men, as analyzed in a recent report by ProPublica, today's movement, like the one before it, might fail to overcome deeply entrenched fears of black criminality without a massive shift in white public opinion and a new model for law enforcement. Here to sort through this pain with me, Columbia University Associate Professor of Political Science and an MSNBC contributor, Dorian Warren, civil rights attorney, Jasmine Rand, Associate Professor at the University of Connecticut and author of Trust in Black America, Race, Discrimination, and Politics, Shayla Nunnally. And also editor-in-chief of globalgrind.com, Michael Skolnick. And from Boston, UCLA professor of social psychology and president of the Center for Policing Equity, Philip Atiba Goff. Philip, I want to start with you because you are the co-author on a recent study, on recent research that found evidence that black boys are actually seen as older and less innocent, and that they prompt a less essential conception of childhood than their white peers who are of the same age, and that actually is related to police violence towards black children. And I'm wondering, given that we know from Vox.com that 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was shot in Cleveland, was assumed to be 20 years old by the police officers who shot him, I'm wondering if you think that is related to the research that you have done there.
Well, it's entirely possible. You know, this came out, the report you're talking about, in the context of two other studies that also found that black children are seen as generally less innocent, that the parole officers and the people who are taking care of them see them as more adult-like at an earlier time. And so in this time when, during that beautiful intro, you talked about black men's pain, I wonder why we're not also talking about protecting black childhood per se, because so many of these people who are getting shot and killed are still babies themselves.
I want to read you one more thing that was said by Officer Wilson in relationship to his experience, and in it he basically said that he felt like that when he had this interaction with Brown at the car, that he felt like he said the only way I can describe it is I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. And we know that he said this despite the fact that Wilson and Brown are basically the same size. So let me ask this. Do you think that this is actually sincere, that in the sense that his subjective experience of Brown was as this demonic, capable of running through bullets Hulk Hogan to his 5-year-old?
I think we need to investigate and think about this moment as if both his sincerity and a lack of sincerity are possible. It's entirely possible that he felt very small. He felt, you know, less than. And in fact, many of the spaces where he speaks in the grand jury testimony, he talks as if his very manhood is at stake. Right? I don't know what I can say on air in terms of the grand jury testimony, but he claims that Mr. Brown said that you're too much of a blank to shoot me. Right? So I think that it's entirely possible. And we would do ourselves a disservice simply to assume that the entire problem rests within the character of Officer Wilson. In fact, as you put out, again, so beautifully in the introduction, this is something that has been culturally, you know, curated for really quite some time, and it lives inside the minds of everybody who's been paying attention to American culture, regardless of what our personal beliefs are. So his sincerity is not so much the question as how do we get that out of our collective conscious and out of our history towards our future.
Hold for me, don't go away, because Dorian, I want to come to you on this, because the extent to which it's in our collective psyche, it's really ours, which is to say that, in fact, African Americans also often reflect these biases about black bodies, about black pain. And part of where I get stuck is that, yes, this has this disproportionate effect when connected with explicit white racism, but it is not exclusively about white racism. It is about a framework of the devaluation of blackness that even black people believe. Devaluation of blackness, dehumanization of blackness. And that's why Darren Wilson could use the word it look like a demon, not he look like a demon. Absolutely. I think Phil is right, though, to bring in the masculinity angle here in terms of the masculinity threat, because I don't think it matters if you're a white man or a black man or a brown man who's a police officer in that context, because black and brown cops beat up and kill young black kids too, and we're not talking about that at the same level. This is not just about white police officers, but about something that happens in police training beyond that thin blue line that we have to have a broader discussion of. But yes, the recent examples of these cases, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, et cetera, these happen to be white cops. So we're focused on that, but it doesn't, race in this sense, it matters in terms of how we all... It's the race of the victim of the... Yes, that's right. That's right. So let me come to you in part on this, because you and I just had a conversation in which you were telling me that you'd been an African-American studies major as an undergraduate. You're an attorney now. And, you know, part of what we talked about yesterday was body cameras and whether or not it would make a difference if the grand jury had seen what happened between Michael Brown and Officer Wilson. And at first I thought, of course it would make a difference. But then I wonder, if everyone is impacted by this belief, might they too have seen this super predator, or is it that Wilson can get away with this narrative because there isn't something else to see?
I think when we're discussing the language and the linguistics we're used, those are so important to me, and I'm glad that you're discussing it on the show today, because when I hear words like him describing Michael Brown as the Hulk, that's a superhuman description. When I hear words like demon, that's a subhuman description. But what's key about both of those things is never once does he see him as just a human being. And when we take this back to the law and apply this to the law, is that a reasonable belief for an officer? Did the officer behave reasonably? When you use words like demon, to me you're saying you view black skin as a sin. And that's not a reasonable belief for any human being to hold. So I think that when we talk about the collective consciousness of our nation, Darren Wilson is not alone in thinking those things. So I think that whether or not we have body cameras, it's a great step, but we have to change the collective consciousness and the way that we allow people to speak about black and brown men in our nation. And Michael, I mean, that feels to me like the harder task. It is, as much as I think Officer Wilson should be held accountable, as much as the grand jury has decided that he should not be, it is still easier to simply vilify one individual. Oh, Michael Brown, excuse me, Officer Wilson is a bad guy. He, you know, and if we just go get all the Officer Wilsons off the forces, everything will be fine. But in fact, if we have a far more complicated, embedded racial angst, then we have to have a different story about this.
Well, speaking of stories, I think that, you know, as we sat around our Thanksgiving, tables with our families, you all have these conversations, and I think that white people in general, they accept these storylines easier because authorities are on our side and we trust them. They accept the storyline of the authority. Right? So Darren Wilson's storyline becomes, George Zimmerman's storyline becomes truth to them, and they no longer question. And good-meaning white people, I'm not talking about, racist, good-meaning people in my family, they believe it's very difficult for them to understand, and the president spoke about it, and you spoke about it in your opening, the history of the racial disparities of wealth and health and education and criminal justice. It's very difficult for us to understand those things, and then to think about the interaction between a police officer and a young black man begins with get the F on the sidewalk. That's not protecting and serving. That is confrontational, and that does not happen in white communities. So it's very difficult for us to understand that relationship between a police officer and a young black man, which is happening all across this country, not just within Ferguson.
And in fact, Philip, let me come back to you very briefly here. It is happening all across this country. Part of what you do is to try to train officers. Where do you have success? What does help to work to change this for officers?
Well, it has to be an everything and approach. You can't just go with, reducing implicit bias. There are ways to do that where you show people a whole bunch of different things. You have to give them history lessons and sociology lessons. But most importantly, you have to make legible to them what I hope is becoming legible to the rest of America, which is that they are, when they're having contact with people in these communities, not a black officer, a white officer, not Officer Wilson. They are frequently the biggest manifestation of the state. And I want to circle back around to something that Dorian said. When people are having these contestations, they're having these engagements, what it feels like to these communities is that my government, the state, is not able to see me as a human being. And when officers can understand that that's the impact of just simple discourtesy sometimes, then they start to get that they have a different kind of power than just the badge and the gun. They have a power to define in the streets in a different way than they ever imagined when they signed up.
Actually, what the state is. Thank you to Philip Atiba Goff in Boston, Massachusetts. We come back. I want to tell you what Darren Wilson said was the hardest thing he ever had to do. Good morning. I'm Melissa Harris Perry. Pain, agony, suffering, hurt. Our nation is full of pain, pain that has been given voice most recently in Ferguson, Missouri. The specific pain of parents who have lost a child and now know that the police officer who killed him will not face criminal charges. The pain of communities who feel helpless in the face of a system that brings so little. Journals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, where he waxed nostalgic for the simpler times of slavery and explained that since emancipation, quote, when a knock is heard at the door, a white woman shudders with nameless horror. The black brute is lurking in the dark, a monstrous beast, crazed with lust. His ferocity is almost demonical. A mad bull or a tiger could scarcely be more brutal. Since the abolition of had difficulty in understanding, acknowledging, and having empathy for the pain of black men. For much of our history, black men have been represented as merciless brutes, unpredictable super predators who can strike without warning at any moment. At the turn of the 20th century, George T. Winston, the president of North Carolina College of Agricultural and Mechanic Arts, what is now NC State University, wrote for the leading academic journal. And this morning, my question, will Ray Rice play in the NFL again? Plus, the new film, She's Beautiful When She's Angry, and why FDR moved Thanksgiving. But first, why we can't feel black men's pain. Justice, a system that seems to supply fresh trauma weekly, adding names to the list of unarmed men and boys whose death is justified by those who claim to have been afraid of them. Oscar, Trayvon, John, Michael, Tamir. The pain of black men themselves. And this is where I want to pause for a moment, this issue of black men's pain, because Americans long have